Good morning. I'm Jackie Miller, host of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing online forum series. Joining you today from the Lekwungen territory, also known as Victoria, BC, where I'm grateful to be able to live, work, and study. We've organized our dialogue today in the memory of Dr. David Schindler, who has been described as Canada's leading ecologist, known for sounding the alarm on acid rain and impacts from the oil sands on the Athabasca Delta, and as a scientist known for, as panelist Dr. Erin Kelly has noted, practicing knowledge co-production with Indigenous peoples before there was a terminology for it. We had planned to have Dr. Schindler join us as a plenary speaker for our in-person forum that we had been planning before moving to an online format in response to COVID-19, and we're deeply saddened to learn of his passing in March. And we've organized today's esteemed group of speakers to share their reflections on his legacy and to reflect on the need for further collaboration across ways of knowing to continue this legacy across the country today. Thank you for joining us as we honor and consider how we can all carry forward his legacy. What he has said to his former students about the knowledge they had learned through their education is just as relevant to this discussion. He said, "It will be up to your generation to enhance this knowledge and use what you learn to protect the planet on which we and other species depend. We've done our best to educate you for this, and I'm confident that you're up to the task." Before we turn to today's dialogue, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. The dialogue will run for approximately an hour and a half. After hearing from our panel and our Reconciling Ways of Knowing project conveners, we'll turn to you, our attendees, for your questions. For this session, the chat will remain open for you to share any thoughts or reflections you have in Dr. Schindler's memory or in relation to the discussion. However, we ask that you put any questions you might have for the Q&A period in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And that's where we'll look for your questions. You can post your questions there at any time during the discussion once the panel gets going. We'll gather like questions together and address them all as we can. And we won't be using the hands raised function today. We're recording the session, so anyone unable to participate for the entire session can view it later online, but we're grateful if you can stay with us for the entire time. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Shauna Morgan-Seegers. Shauna Morgan-Seegers lives in rural Manitoba and is a member of the Crees of Waskaganish First Nation and has a long history of living and working with First Nations and tribes across Turtle Island. Shauna is the operations manager for the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and is one of the core visionaries behind the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science project as it has developed. Over to you, Shauna.
Thank you, Jackie. Bonjour, Anamaki Gabi Dewi Dang Disnigas. My Anishinaabe name is Under the Clouds They Are Coming, which literally means the sound of rolling thunder. And as Jackie said, my First Nation is Waskaganish Cree Nation. I'd like to start today by introducing you to Elder Alice Rigney, who is a fluent Denisoolan speaker from Athabasca Chipewyan Nation in Northern Alberta. And Alice has dedicated herself to passing that knowledge on to other people, reviving the Denisoolan language by teaching classes in Deneyati 3 times a week, and speaking Denisoolan on CBC North. She's a community coordinating several events such as NA Gathering in Fort Chipewyan in 2005, the Residential School Reunion in 2007, and the Fort Chipewyan Keepers of the Water Conference in 2008, where Dr. Schindler was a speaker. Elder Alice met Dr. Schindler several times and knew him since the 1970s when he began coming to Fort Chipewyan. Elder Alice, would you please provide us with an opening prayer for our dialogue and honor the 215 children found buried in Kamloops, their families, and all the survivors. Oh, you're on mute.
Haraliu Sahelot in a Sazi Alice Rigney, I telot a Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. Edri Sanene Bagani Tant Essen. Enne Edri Otib Lant A. My name is Alice Rigney. I'm from Gaitail, Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. The name Gaitail means land of the willows, which indicates our delta, the Peace Athabasca Delta. And I want to say a prayer in my language, and then I will start my little speech. Notsene, du denek enereske, dan du noyatia hichu, dan du denebeyatia hichu, haryut anuritak, bedziadan is wale, da benia wale, hotia dan not e wale, e a haryun sejia anereskese, masi. Before I start, let us think of the 215 angels who are going to uncover the truth, which is just the tip of the iceberg. And I also think of the relatives that are going to be told of their connection to these children. And what I have to say now, I speak for many. And if you could, take the time to close your eyes and listen to my voice. Who would not be hurt when the news announced to the world of the 215 children in unmarked graves? As a survivor and as a daughter of a survivor, I spent 10 years in the Holy Angels. I relived many negative feelings, PTSD, hate, and tears upon tears. I cried for all the children that attended these places where they took our identity away and left us wondering why our parents let this happen. I think of all my brothers and sisters that I came to love in the mission that became my family. My mother later told me that after they dropped us off in the mission and they went back to Jackfish, her and my dad would cry for us at the table because the house was so quiet. We were children, but we need closure so our spirit will soar free. In the meantime, do not let the discovery create too much sadness, anger, hate, and much more negative feelings. This is weight on our minds and shoulders we don't need. Be kind, reach out. There's someone listening. Masicho.
Masicho, Elder Alice, for opening today's dialogue in a good way. Waje everyone, I'm joining you today from my front yard in rural southern Manitoba in Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people. I wanted to start briefly by telling you a little story about the time I met Dr. Schindler. It was briefly through my good friend and colleague, Dr. Trish Sellers, when he came to our offices while waiting for a flight to leave Winnipeg. Trish knew Dr. Schindler well from her time as a graduate student at the Experimental Lakes area in Ontario. And at the time, it was about 20 years ago, Trish and I were working a lot on climate change with First Nations across Canada. And Dr. Schindler shared with her a table that he had created documenting Indigenous knowledge, observations of climate change alongside Western science observations of climate change, and showing that they were saying the same things. At the time, I found this remarkable because it was rare back in those days to meet a scientist who recognized the Indigenous people's knowledge. And I know that Dr. Schindler had a great influence on my friend Trish. She later went on to use her Western science training to address the environmental injustices in Grassy Narrows First Nation by looking at the mercury contamination there. Trish worked alongside Grassy Narrows for more than a decade until her untimely death in 2017. Our dialogue today is centered around Dr. Schindler and the way he used his Western science to advocate for environmental justice, which supported First Nations as well as the lands and waters. He was fearless. In the planning stages of, as Jackie said, we had intended to have Dr. Schindler as a keynote at that event, and sadly that did not happen. So we were hosting this tribute to Dr. Schindler as another way to share the approach that he took in his work with Indigenous nations that inspired my friend Trish and hopefully will inspire you. I'd also like all of you to know that Reconciling Ways of Knowing is working on paying tribute in the near future to another equally inspiring Indigenous elder who worked alongside scientists to reconcile the two ways of knowing. And her name was Dr. Mary Thomas. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's panelists, a group of folks who knew Dr. Schindler well. First, Dr. David Suzuki. He's a father, a grandfather, environmental activist, an award-winning geneticist and broadcaster. He's particularly known for his roles on CBC's radio show, Quirks and Quarks, and CBC Television's The Nature of Things. For his support of Canada's Indigenous peoples, Dr. Suzuki has been honored with 8 Indigenous names and formal adoption by 2 First Nations. Secondly, we have Melody Lapine, who is a member of the Mi'kmaq Cree First Nation from Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, and someone who I've known for about 15 years. She studied environmental conservation science at the University of Alberta and is nearly completed her Master's of Environment and Management from the Royal Roads University. As the director of the Mi'kmaq Cree First Nation Government and Industry Relations, where she has worked since 2003, she's responsible for overseeing all government and industry consultation pertaining to resource development in the Mi'kmaq Cree territory. Next, we have Lisa Tazazi. She is a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, also located in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, and she has her degree in environmental sciences from the University of Alberta. Since 2004, she has worked for the Athabasca Chipewyan Dene Lands and Resource Management Department, where she is now the director. In this role, she guides the strategic relationship between resource developers, government agencies, and the community, while upholding her mandate to protect her nation's treaty and Aboriginal rights to the land, water, air, and livelihood. And finally, rounding on our panel, we have Dr. Erin Kelly, who was a PhD and postdoctoral student and co-researcher with Dr. Schindler, and is currently the Deputy Minister of the Government of the Northwest Territories, Department of Environment and Natural Resources. She played a lead role in establishing the Thai-Dene National Park Reserve and has been responsible for leading the implementation of the Climate Change Strategic Framework, the NWT Water Stewardship Strategy, Waste Resource Management Strategy, and Knowledge Agenda. So let's start today's dialogue with Dr. Suzuki. David, do you mind turning your camera on there?
Okay, here I go.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
David, as a scientist and Reconciling Ways of Knowing convener, how did Dr. Schindler inspire you as a scientist who spoke truth to power and who showed genuine respect for Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge?
Well, I will answer that question eventually, but I think the others will also show in fulsome ways the impact he has had. I just wanted to set this more in the within the broader context of reconciling ways of knowing, if you don't mind. First, I'd like to say I am speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Wiwe Kay Nation on Quadra Island in British Columbia. Humans have always known that we were embedded in nature. We called it Mother Earth, Turtle Island, scientists call it the biosphere. But we lived within a web of relationships with all other species of animals and plants, with air, water, soil, and sunlight. This is something that has been celebrated since the beginning of human time. We celebrated, gave thanks for nature's generosity and abundance, and we acknowledged that we had responsibility. And we learn to live in place through the successes, the failures, the mistakes of past generations, which of course is the distillate of Indigenous knowledge everywhere. It was really the coming of the great age of exploration when people came to new lands, conquered the peoples, colonized the lands, that they brought a different way of seeing their place in the world. That is, we saw opportunity in these new lands, resources, we saw potential wealth, and that has been the driving force of the cultures that have taken over these lands. Ever since Isaac Newton's time, and this is in the 1400s during the Renaissance, we learned that science was a powerful way of learning about the world around. And science, through Newton's eyes, involved focusing on a part of nature, whether it's a subatomic particle, an atom, molecule, a cell. Focus and control everything impinging on that bit of nature, measure everything coming in and going out, and you acquire a great understanding of that fundamental part that you're studying. But of course, in the process, you lose all sense of the context within which that bit of nature you're studying exists and makes it important. And I think it's that problem of losing sight of the context that is the great weakness of science, that is corrected if we look at science through the eyes of Indigenous people, in which everything is connected to everything else. When Paul Mueller discovered that DDT kills insects, he won a Nobel Prize in 1948. And as DDT began to be used widely, then we discovered what scientists couldn't know, and that is that it rains, the wind blows, it snows, and guess what? It ends up in our rivers and lakes and affects fish, birds, and women. That only came about much later when we learned about biomagnification up the food chain. When atomic bombs were dropped on Japan in 1945, scientists didn't know there was a thing called radioactive fallout. They didn't know about electromagnetic pulses of gamma rays or the possibility of nuclear winter. So our knowledge was not able to see the interconnectedness of everything, and our knowledge was so limited. We don't know enough about the world to know the impact of the things that we're inventing. I got a PhD in 1961, and I was a hotshot geneticist. And we took, in 1961, I worked with fruit flies, and we were proud of the fact that we were doing basic research. We didn't claim to, we looked down our noses at medical geneticists because they were applied scientists. What we thought was we were exploring the basic secrets of nature. But what has happened since I got my PhD is there has been a huge emphasis on applying the knowledge, the incremental insights we gain in order to patent the idea and make money, or to support certain corporations. And so the whole nature of the scientific enterprise has changed. Now people are thinking, how can I make money? How can I patent this application? And so we don't share the knowledge broadly. Now, in the past, the university was a very special place. The university was where people, scholars, dreamers, artists came together and explored knowledge at the cutting edge of human thought. And that was often very threatening to society. It's not an accident that many revolutions start in universities. And in order to protect these scholars and dreamers, universities gave tenure. For me, certainly tenure was a great liberating force, to be able to share what I know without fear that I would get canned from the government. And we got in the university government grants. And that means that we were taking money from the public in order to carry out our research. But increasingly, money began to come in for specific things. If you go through UBC, the forest faculty, you'll see signs everywhere of the major corporations that are supporting research in the forestry faculty. If you go through the energy departments, you're going to find, or let's say if you go through the ecology lists at the University of Calgary or the University of Alberta, guess what? A lot of them, most of them are getting money from the fossil fuel industry. And that makes a difference. When we, the Nature of Things decided to do a program on the development of the tar sands, when Peter Lougheed was in office, there was one plant exploiting the tar sands at Syncrude. And Lougheed was talking about 10 more plants bigger than Syncrude. And we said, wow, that's a lot of acid rain. Let's do a show on the tar sands. And we went to the faculty of biology at University of Alberta, lots of ecologists. None of them would speak to us on camera. So then we went to the University of Calgary, same thing, lots of ecologists. Nobody would speak to us. Why? Because they were all getting money from the fossil fuel industry. When we decided to do a program on logging in the Haida Gwaii, this is way back in 1980, one of the scientists, a botanist from the University of British Columbia, was up there doing research, and he was in the restaurant in the hotel having breakfast. And when he met the crew I was shooting with went a day earlier than I was. And when he found out that they were shooting for the Nature of Things and I was going to come up, he started cussing me out and saying, that guy has no business being in a university. He's got involved in a political issue that he has no credibility as a scientist. This is a guy whose entire reputation was based on studying a group of plants called bryophytes, only found in Haida Gwaii and nowhere else in the world. And they would be threatened by the logging that was going on. But in the name of scientific expertise, he would not compromise his expertise by fighting to stop the logging that was threatening the plants on which he based his reputation. So that's the context within which I want you to think about science that's being practiced. I met David Schindler when there was a hearing about a big pulp mill that a Japanese company was going to put in the Boreal in Alberta. And I was shocked at his presentation. Here was a scientist working at the University of Alberta, and Alberta was keen on getting the money for this plant. And he just got up as an ecologist and showed why this is crazy to build that plant. And over the years since then, I've watched his contributions in so many issues that had economic, political ramifications, in which he just gave his findings as a scientist without any concern about the political announcements, implications. And, you know, when the Swedes announced they were going to give an award that was comparable to a Nobel Prize, it was called the Stockholm Water Prize. And David Schindler won the first one. I mean, it was a huge, I was just blown away that a Canadian scientist would win this big prestigious award. Alberta wouldn't even acknowledge or honor him for winning that prize. And that shows the environment within which he functioned. He single-handedly through his work, showed that what the government of Alberta was claiming about the harmlessness of the tar sands operations ecologically, he single-handedly just shot that whole thing down. It was an astounding demonstration of good science and courage, in that he didn't fear the effects. I can't imagine the pressure that he was under. I'm sorry that Suzanne, his wife, felt it was just not prepared to talk about that. She could have told us in very personal terms the enormous pressures that were brought to bear on him. You get a kind of implication, you know, this organization that Craig Kielburger founded, that got involved in this big scandal and with Trudeau, but we had these big events in which they, brought together tens of thousands of Canadian kids. And apparently, I didn't know that they flashed at one point a variety of images of Canadian heroes, and I was one of them. I didn't know that. And an oil supporter said, pull that thing off. He has no business being a part of your program. And they did. That just in a tiny way shows the sensitivity to the fossil fuel industry. Well, you all heard about what happened when the University of Alberta, which was the first place that I got a job back in Canada when I came back from the United States, and they decided to give me an honorary degree, and the enormous pressure on the university to stop that award. Again, such a trivial thing, and yet the power of the industry. There was a memorial held for Dave, I don't know, a month or so ago, and I didn't know it, but that memorial was being organized partly by the University of Alberta. And Dave's son, Daniel, told me after the memorial, they wanted the University of Alberta to post the announcement of the memorial with a list of the program, and they dithered and they wouldn't put it on their website. They wouldn't make the announcement. And finally, on the last day, they didn't do it. And the reason it turned out was because I was one of the people on the list, and they were afraid of the fossil fuel industry pulling some of the support they give. So, this is the context within which we see this giant in science. A giant because his colleagues, the vast majority of them, are cowed by the power of industry, and very afraid, even ones with tenure, very afraid of speaking out for fear of antagonizing the industry that also has a huge supportive effect on the universities. So you will hear the stories of people who worked with Dave, were students of Dave, and hear the impact of his work as a scientist. But I find that as a man who used his science to go out and tell the truth, what the implications were, and do that with such courage and yet humility. My goodness, what a role model he was for scientists. And I just want to speak here to honor him, to honor what he did, and hope that his influence will continue through the people that were affected by what he did. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing the scientific and social and political context that Dr. Schindler was working in, and which was extreme in many cases. And now we're going to turn to Melody Lapine. who can speak to some of those extreme conditions that Dr. Schindler had to work under. And maybe Melody, you can share how he engaged with your First Nation, respected your elders and Indigenous knowledge, how he earned your trust, and how others might be able to carry forward with his legacy of respect.
Thank you, Shauna. I'm happy to join from Fort McMurray, Treaty 8 territory, and the ancestral lands of the Cree, Dene, and Métis people. And what an honor to be a part of a dialogue about a great man, a great scientist, and really a person that magnified and a true champion of many of our issues in our community. We consider ourselves people of the Delta, as Elder Alice talked about. The Delta is absolutely everything for us. And I think it meant so much to Dr. Schindler as well, just considering all of the work and efforts that he assisted us on, and until recently with our UNESCO work in helping protect our Delta. I first learned about a lot of Dr. Schindler's work when I was in high school, when I actually decided I wanted to pursue studies in environmental science to help work on environmental issues for my community. I heard about this amazing study that was going on that included talking with many land users and elders and youth in my community. It was called the Northern River Basin Study. And there was a strong advisory group led by some amazing leaders in our community, like Sunny Flett, Willie Coudray, and Elder Pat Marcel. Two have passed now, but strong mentors for me in terms of leading the way of incorporating Indigenous knowledge in science, and being an active part of important studies that would shape the future of environmental stewardship in our region. I met Dave then a few years later after finishing university. It was actually in the banks of the Athabasca River, just by Fort McKay, and I was about to get in a canoe and paddle down the Athabasca River as part of a CBC documentary with Dr. David Suzuki, just highlighting the importance of the Athabasca River and bringing and drawing attention to the issues of the Athabasca region in particular, challenged with massive, enormous tar sands extraction. And I spent a few days, talking to Dr. Schindler about the importance of the river and the importance of protecting the river to our community. And then he told me many stories about the work that he already had done in Fort Chip. And then I learned so much about the Northern River Basin Study. That fall, Dr. Schindler was on a panel in our first major regulatory intervention opposing two major oil sands projects. Dr. Schindler was front and center on our expert panel, bringing, I think a lot of credibility to the science that we had to bring forward. For the first time, we felt equal. We felt that we had experts in our corner that could defend the work that we were doing, defend the knowledge of our elders and land users who desperately were trying to protect their environment. And so Dr. Schindler was our key witness in several regulatory hearings. And I say several because there's been at least 8 or 9 that I've led interventions on. And I think he basically not only recognized and tried to validate and bring attention and magnify the issues of our community, but he drew public attention. And people wanted to hear what he had to say about the Athabasca River, what he had to say about downstream impacts, what he had to say about protecting our delta. And so we needed that attention. We had been ignored for decades about the issues, downstream issues, our community. Dr. John O'Connor was also on our panel, raising the issues of health concerns. And then Dr. Schindler did a study. He undertook some studies on the Athabasca River, again, validating, confirming, our community's worst fears that there were contaminants in the river, that they could be making their way into us through the traditional foods that we're consuming. And so the first thing that Dr. Schindler did when he was about to publicly release his study was he made a commitment, he made a promise to our community that nothing will be released until I come and share it with you. The results need to be heard by the community first. And so he did that presentation with the community. And, like many studies like Dr. Schindler has done, there was like, finally a scientist agrees with us. Finally, a scientist is backing up our claims and our worst fears that our delta is dying, that our health is deteriorating. And so again, he magnified the issues, he validated the truth and facts that my community has been stating for several years. And so for that, he is definitely fearless, challenging industry, challenging government to do better, including calling on the federal government to protect treaty. He understood how sacred and important our treaty relationship was and the protection of our way of life. And so he often wrote op-eds and voiced concerns about the federal government failing in honoring our treaty. So not only was he a scientist to us, but he was our friend and our advocate to many of our issues and concerns. And I often wonder who will be next? Who will be the next scientist to stand in our corner to help elevate our concerns and bring attention to some significant and challenging issues in our region? A few years ago, after several regulatory interventions, being defeated, feeling defeated, we went to the international community. We filed a petition to UNESCO to raise awareness of the drying of our delta, the delta issues that we have. And Dr. Schindler supported our petition, along with, a few other scientists. And so just not too long ago, a few years ago, we invited Dr. Schindler to the community to present to the International Reactive Monitoring Mission what he saw as improvements to the delta, gave some strong recommendations to the reactive monitoring mission experts. And today we have an action plan developed by the federal government, an action plan to hopefully draw attention and resources in doing the job of protecting our delta. Again, because of the support and help by great scientists and a wonderful man, Dr. Schindler. We did a video for our UNESCO petition, and because Dr. Schindler is world renowned, we knew that including him in our video would get the attention of UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee. And so we would like to share that little clip of the video during our presentation to show just how much support he provided to our community and how fearless and how much he magnified and brought the public attention to some significant issues, challenges to our delta. So I will let Jackie play the video when she has an opportunity. Thank you.
Protection.
We've been trapping here all our life, hunting, fishing. Seem to forget that these values have to be protected, have to be passed down to the next generation.
For the Mixto Cree First Nation, the Wood Buffalo National Park, this is an opportunity to protect our traditional ways and our inherent treaty rights.
The park is supposed to be protected, but with development all around, the entire ecosystem is at risk. And that means the Mikshu is at risk.
Mikisew tries to engage with industry and government regarding the ways resource development impact our traditional lands and our way of life. We've got contamination from oil sands to the south. The delta is drying up because of the tremendous water use in the oil sands and a number of hydroelectric dams in BC to the west. Uranium abandonment on Lake Athabasca to the east. And to exacerbate everything, we have climate change. And then in the midst of this, the federal and provincial governments have just gutted their environmental protection legislation.
The biggest threat to the delta from the oil sands is the rate at which they use water and the release of contaminants to air and water. Oil sands mining and processing require enormous volumes of water already, and given the projections, it's likely to double in the near future.
We've seen steady declines of water levels and flow rates on the Athabasca River, and we know damn well that when it gets here, it's polluted.
Recent studies show that There are millions of liters a day of toxins seeping from the tailings ponds into the Athabasca River, and then they're carried downstream to the Peace Athabasca Delta.
A tailings breach would just be disastrous, and this disaster is becoming more likely every day as governments fail to enforce their already inadequate regulations.
Even without a spill, the tailings ponds offer a deadly resting spot for wildlife, like migratory birds, especially as they replace natural wetland habitat.
Like today, we don't eat as many birds as we used to.
We're seeing increasing mercury in birds and their eggs in the Peace Athabasca Delta. In addition, we're seeing increasing malformations in fish that are probably the result of some of the contaminants in the oil sands.
Things are about to get worse. The world's largest oil sands mine ever is proposed to be built on the park's doorstep.
This latest project is in a watershed that drains into the Wood Buffalo National Park. Right in the most critical migratory route for birds in North America, including endangered whooping crane.
Chi-miigwech, Melody, for sharing that story and the ways that Dr. Schindler showed respect to your nation by coming to you first with his research to share those results with you and giving you that privacy to be able to digest them before those went public. And the way that describing the way that he would stand up and speak out and stand beside the Miksuk Cree First Nation. So Chi-miigwech for that. Lisa, I wonder if you wouldn't mind now taking center stage and sharing with the ways that you knew Dr. Schindler and how he engaged with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation and how others can help to continue his legacy.
Yes, Masicho Agwanate. I'm Lisa Tazazi, calling from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation here in Fort McMurray. I want to thank you for allowing me to join this wonderful panel and thank our elder Alice for the wonderful prayer and remembering those young people we lost. I first met Dr. Schindler at the U of A studying. Both Mel and I took the same program, U of A. And when you're in an institution and you're learning and you come from a traditional background of living on the land, it's really foreign to go into that university system and be you have to learn your Eurocentric ways, you have to learn Western values, and they don't align with yours. So when I took Dr. Schindler's class, I felt finally someone who has the same values of me, of talking that holistic world point view where everything is interwoven and affect one another. It felt relieved. It felt relieved to finally sit in a class that got me, that felt like I belonged. So right away when I first met him in the U of A, I felt that connection. He was well respected in supporting our work, and both Melody and I do a lot of work over it's almost been 2 decades now that we've done a lot of work together here. And it felt really good to have someone like Dr. Schindler beside us. It felt good to have him just stand with us and honor us and compliment what we've already been saying. So he brought forward that impact of the evidence, brought forward the evidence that we were saying all along. And he was in hearing after hearing, and it was so, everybody always wanted to tune in on the hearing or be there just to listen to him, because he just didn't sugarcoat anything. He would just tell it like it is. As blunt as he was, that was good. And people needed to hear it. And when you say it blunt like that, you got someone's attention and they're paying attention or listening. So hopefully in the chat feed, you're getting some of the media links that he's had over the years, and a lot of the quotes. He made the front page. He was in the news. When when these hearings were going on and he came forward with his evidence, everybody was listening. So honor him for that and standing with us. His credible research couldn't be refuted by industry or government. And when you're able to look into these hearings and hear how he's cross-examined by industry, cross-examined by both levels of government, even by the panel members themselves, it was good to just hear how grounded he was, how much you just couldn't poke holes in the work he did. And that felt good. It felt good that someone so credible was there saying the same things that we did in the Western research way, and we were complementing it through the traditional knowledge and the changes we saw over the land, and we're still seeing those changes now. His work did force government industry to change how monitoring and managing of this region here is underway right now. He called the Regional Aquatics Monitoring Program what it was, and Melody and I had to remove ourselves from that program. And we were in the meetings just saying, you know, how is this independent research? This isn't independent, this is self-monitoring. And we kept saying that, industry didn't like that. You guys are self-monitoring. They didn't like that. So we had to remove ourselves from those programs because they weren't credible. They weren't independent and a view of how you're monitoring. So he pulled that whole program apart too and helped us, saying, you know, now we have OSM, which is the Oil Sands Monitoring Program, and we're still checking. We're still holding governments accountable. We're still holding industry accountable. That will never stop. What we do need is more fearless researchers, spokespeople like Dr. Schindler. We need that voice to stand with us still. It was an honor to see during a tour, I don't know if they're able to post a picture of Chief Adam with Dr. Schindler and Neil Young in a tour called Honoring the Treaty. And it really raised a profile of how important our work was, that we're not just raising all these concerns and issues and intervening because of our effects. We're raising these issues because we signed treaty. We signed treaty with Canada, with the federal government, and we're asking the governments to honor that treaty and to ensure that our people are here far into the future, far, because we've been here for thousands of generations. And why wouldn't we be here for thousands more? So he helped raise our profile of, hey, they're not just, you know, raising concerns and going to these hearings just to be loud. We're doing it because we care about the future. And it felt good to see him stand with us in that tour, in all the media releases that we did. They're called press conferences. It felt good to have him there. But we always said that we're not opposed to development. We work with the developers, we work with industry, we work with government. But how can you manage the work of this tar sands, this oil sands, in a way that doesn't affect your ability to go on the land still? Our ability for my children to go pick those berries and plants and eat them without a fear of, you know, they're going to get hurt. So we need more scientists to take that leap of, you know, let's ask the hard questions, just like Dr. Schindler did. Ask the hard questions. Are these management programs working? Is government doing enough? Are we up to the standards that we need to be? Because in our view, we're not. We're not managing and holding the regulations in a standard that protects our use. And I say that because about 10 years ago, we signed we had a report called As the River Flows, and it identified these thresholds of what the Athabasca River needed in levels to protect our use on the land. Our ability to continue our use on that river, it meant that it had to be at this threshold. And we gave that to industry, we gave it to government, both levels of government. And still today, those thresholds are not in place to protect us. In my view, this region is still not at the standard that respects our use, respects our needs, or protects our rights. And it was champions like Dr. Schindler and late Pat Marcel who pushed those bureaucrats, meeting after meeting and election after election. We would sit there and meet with them again. And their first question would be, what are your concerns? And Pat and I would just lose it. Like, how can you not know what our concerns are? We've only been saying these things for the last 200 years. Anyway, he stood by us. He complimented our work. He helped our voice. And our elders demanded change. We wouldn't tolerate what the bureaucrats and the industry say. But who's going to help us now? Who are the champions out there right now listening, who are gonna go that extra step, no matter what industry says, no matter what the universities say? Who's gonna take that step and join us and to be the champions to carry out this important work? Because there's still a lot of work to do. We still haven't seen the health study, a community health study. We haven't seen a lot of the other traditional resources to identify what we need to protect our rights. But even if we did all that work, how do you bring that forward to the government systems to make change that would protect us? Why are we monitoring and monitoring and monitoring? And if you're detecting the change in the ecosystems we rely on, what are you doing about that change? What are you doing to change how we won't be affected? Because I don't see any. I don't see any monitoring that's gonna change how we feel like we're protected. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. We're not going away. And we call on you as young people and students and to help us to carry this forward. And we honor Dr. Schindler for being there for us. Merci cho.
Merci cho, Lisa, for sharing your experiences and your stories, and for helping us to understand better how Dr. Schindler used his voice to complement the Indigenous knowledge of Athabasca Chippewan Nation, and also for, as you said, asking those hard questions, to speak the truth about the regional monitoring system when it wasn't creating credible research. So thank you. Now we're going to turn to Erin. You spent years working closely with Dr. Schindler. Can you share, and I've got quite a tall order here for you, the impact that Dr. Schindler had on you as your advisor for your PhD, the work that you did with him as a postdoctoral student and a co-researcher. Share a little bit about the kind of scientific and collaborative knowledge production practices that you learned while working with him, and described how these helped to shape your career that you have now working with Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories.
Thank you very much. I'll do my best. Thank you for having me here today to honor Dave. And thank you very much to Alice for the opening prayer. It's really nice to see her after all these years, and also to see Melody and others. My name is Erin Kelly, and I'm joining you today from Chief Dragi's territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, and also the homeland of the North Slave Métis Alliance. It's hard to believe that it's been just over 20 years since my time in the Schindler Lab began. I studied fish ecology at Trent University, and I had received an NSERC to do my master's. And I was looking for a supervisor. And to be honest with you, I was interested in working with Bill Tunn at the University of Alberta. And when I filled out and sent in the application form, there was a section to identify interest in working with other U of A researchers, and Dr. David Schindler was one of the names on the list. I found Dave's listed research interests really intriguing, and I remember asking my supervisor at the time if Dave was the Schindler responsible for the Schindler patalis trap, which we had used to sample zooplankton in one of our courses. And I remember that he laughed, and he said that he was, as well as being responsible for groundbreaking research on eutrophication, acid rain, climate change, atmospheric transport of pollutants, and important policy changes around the world. He said, "David Schindler does science that changes people's lives." So I ticked the box beside Dave's name. And it's amazing that such a small action can change your life. Dave called me and I went to visit his lab. Sorry. And when I asked him what projects he had available, he said, "You can do whatever you want." And he gave me a bunch of papers to read and ideas to consider. Other researchers that I spoke to had one or two well-developed projects available for a master's student. So I packed my things and I jumped in my Ford Ranger and I made my way to Edmonton for a life-changing experience. In addition to Dave's epic academic skills, he could communicate meaningfully with anyone about science. He listened carefully to the people who live from the land and water, and particularly recognized the critical importance of the stewardship of Indigenous peoples. Dave ingrained in me that the people that take care of the land know it best. He taught me the importance of connections with people of differing experiences, knowledge systems, critical thinking, asking questions, especially the hard ones, and listening. When I had a question, he introduced me to people from his extensive network, former students, academics, government scientists, knowledge holders, land users, policy folks. He encouraged me to read and to ask the right questions and to learn from those who know and then draw my own conclusions. I did my thesis research on mercury in Rocky Mountain Lake food webs. I can still remember Dave and a former sled dog of his, I believe it was Chickpea, meeting me at Mobe Lake in Jasper to support me on my first field trip for my project and my first trip ever to the Rocky Mountains. He watched me sample, no pressure at all, and then he trusted me to sample 35 other lakes. And when the watershed of Mobe Lake burned the next year, he encouraged me to complete research on the effects of fire on mercury towards a PhD rather than a master's. It was a life-changing experience. While working in the Rocky Mountain parks, we found that fishes from some of the lakes we sampled had mercury concentrations that were above consumption guidelines. And I remember talking to Dave about the results and him asking me, "So what are you going to do? Who needs to know? Go and talk to them." So I presented the results to the park managers and the communities, and the park managers were concerned because they didn't know if there were other lakes that hadn't been sampled that had fish with elevated mercury concentrations. So they put out guidance for all Rocky Mountain lakes with fish. And even though it wasn't part of the planned thesis work, Dave agreed that we could use available data to try to develop a model to predict which lakes could have higher mercury concentrations in fish so that park managers would have an idea of where to prioritize their sampling, and people in the area would be able to use that information to inform decisions about where they fished. Once I was done my PhD, I moved to Yellowknife to work for a consulting company. And Dave called me about 6 months later and said, "Are you done with consulting yet?" And he asked me to do my postdoc on the oil sands. And again, working with him changed my life. That project was a huge learning experience. And I once again saw the true value of being part of a collaborative project with a community with both science and Indigenous knowledge as the foundation. Research questions were based on science and community experience and concerns. Sites were selected collaboratively in the traditional use areas of the Delta. Research and travel on the land occurred with Indigenous guides, and we collaboratively reviewed results from multiple knowledge perspectives. I clearly saw firsthand the importance of Indigenous knowledge and community involvement, and can still remember visiting Fort Chip to present and discuss results with Dave Schindler and John O'Connor. And I'll never forget Alice Rigney, an Athabasca Chippewa First Nation elder, who handed me a piece of rat root at the end of my first presentation, and I still have it to this day, to continually remind me of the lessons I learned and the need to continue to apply them. Dave certainly piqued my interest in the North, and specifically in the Northwest Territories, where I've been living for the last 14 years. He wrote that the water resources of the Northwest Territories make it one of the most important places in the world. He spoke of his experiences in the NWT, dog sledding. He took part as a science advisor, as Melody mentioned, on the Northern River Basin study, and as expert witness during the review of the first diamond mines in the Northwest Territories. He was also the member of 2 Rosenberg International Forum panels that provided water policy advice to the government of the Northwest Territories. He wrote that Indigenous people of the Northwest Territories have never needed anyone to tell them that the water that they have relied on for millennia are special and even sacred. He had heard many Indigenous people of the North talk about water as the beating heart of their lands. He encouraged us all to think about water that way and to work together to ensure that the heart beats for our children and grandchildren. Dave was truly a strong advocate and ally for the North. In my work with the government of the Northwest Territories, I've had the opportunity to apply everything that Dave taught me while working with Indigenous governments and organizations and other partners, including communities, academics, industry, and non-government organizations. We work together in various capacities on the collaborative development and implementation of the NWT Water Stewardship Strategy, community-based water quality monitoring programs, source water protection initiatives, and negotiating transboundary water management agreements with other Mackenzie River Basin jurisdictions. Dave was always far ahead of his time, not only scientifically, but also with respect to knowledge co-production and reconciliation from my perspective. He was a strong advocate for the meaningful inclusion of local and Indigenous knowledge in monitoring, research, policy, and decision-making long before it became more common practice. Dave's focus on both the fundamental relationship that Indigenous peoples have with their environment and the importance of Indigenous knowledge most certainly has influenced my research and my work. And more recently, Dave spoke to the role that protected areas play in reconciliation with Indigenous people. He put his support behind Indigenous-led conservation efforts, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, also known as IPCAs, and Indigenous guardian programs. And this support extended to the co-management of wildlife, water, forest, and protected areas that exist in the Northwest Territories. We have much work to do, but all of our protected areas in the NWT are IPCAs, including Thaidenenene in the east arm of Great Slave Lake, Tuyeta in the Sawtoo, and work continues on Denegawekahodi in the north arm of Great Slave Lake. Guardian programs have increased over the last 5 years, with more on the horizon. Dave was always pushing for us to collectively do right by the environment and the people who rely on it. And my biggest wish is that we will all continue to take action to ensure Dave's legacy endures for generations to come. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Erin. You touched my heart to see the love that you had for David. So miigwech for that. And it was just wonderful to hear the ways, the so many ways that Dr. Schindler changed your life. And I love the questions he asked you, when you got your first results. What are you going to do about it? And who needs to hear this? So important. And the way he taught you to listen to the local and the Indigenous people. And also the way he talked about water as the beating heart of the land. And it's something I've heard many elders talk about, water being the lifeblood of the land. And as we all know, it's so essential to our lives. So at this moment, I'd like to bring in some more of our Reconciling Ways of Knowing conveners. I think I'll invite Dr. Nancy Turner to join us first. And Nancy, do you have any, maybe if you can turn your camera and your mic on, do you have any reflections on the dialogue we've heard today that you'd like to share?
Thank you so much, Shauna. Um, I'm here on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation on Protection Island off Nanaimo, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to hear all these amazing tributes to an amazing man. I want to thank Elder Alice Rigney for the wonderful opening, and each of the speakers. You had so much to share. And I just, I didn't know David well. I met him a few times. He was always a hero to me, seeing the work that he did that has been confirmed by all of the presenters here today. And to me, he remains a model, and he always will, of how scientists can support Indigenous peoples through careful collaborative research, addressing issues and problems that are important to the people and to their lands and waters. He's also a model for all of us on how to maintain one's integrity and incorporate the values that we know are part of the human soul of each individual. And I just think of the words of each of you that you've presented. David talked about the web of relationships that scientists need to understand better. And essentially the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And you can't understand something thoroughly without looking at the relationships and the web that joins everything together. Melody talked about how David Schindler defended and validated elders' knowledge and the truth, and honored treaty relationships. He had courage, humility, fearlessness. He was a friend, an advocate, and an ally, and a champion. All of these are words that were used in these presentations, and they all are a way of paying tribute to this man and his character. Lisa talked about everything being interwoven, and David Schindler didn't sugarcoat anything. He said it like it is. He was grounded and so credible. And Erin, your description of how your own learning journey with David Schindler, and how he supported you and he encouraged you and he challenged you in so many ways. And the quote that I got from you is, "The people that take care of the land know it the best." And I think that's just sums it all up. And maybe more than one of you also said there's still a lot of work to do. And that's an important message for all of us to take to our hearts. So thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this really wonderful tribute to a truly great man. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And now we'll turn it over to my good friend, Miles Richardson. Kilsley Kaji Singh. Miles.
Hello, Shauna. Thank you. I'm just, can't add anything to this beautiful tribute to a very respected friend of mine. I am honored to participate and just to remember him and acknowledge the difference that he made in all of your lives, all of our lives. And I think we're just beginning to understand that. Dr. Schindler was a scientist, and he's a really good example of what we're trying to do in reconciling ways of knowing, is bringing together two ways of knowing that affect all of our lives here in what's today's Canada, and to build a dialogue on that. Dr. Schindler was a scientist, and from that from that way of knowing, he relentlessly sought to understand the truth in a discipline that talks about that, but when it doesn't always seem to stay at the forefront when other interests come in to play. We bring that together with the Indigenous way of knowing, which also in a much broader, in many ways more philosophical and principled way, seeks the truth. And there's only one truth we're after. And often we keep those separate. In reconciling ways of knowing, we're trying to find ways of bringing those together because we need them both. And David Schindler understood that. He recognized that and recognized the power of that. And having believed that, he had the courage to live that and to infuse that in his communications and his relations with others. He was a powerful force. And I noticed him as he relentlessly brought science to the debate around the Alberta oil sands, the tar sands, where industry wouldn't allow basic monitoring of critical factors to the health of humans. David and others relentlessly kept researching and brought these facts forward. And, you know, it might be a small step, but, you know, a decent minister of the environment in Ottawa, Jim Prentice, picks up on that and is able to move forward in measuring these things. A very small step, but are the type of difference you can make with this courage and this commitment to the discipline of science. I got to spend a few years with Dr. Schindler on the board of the David Suzuki Foundation, and he exonerated, what do you call champions? He was a stand-up guy. He believed in something. He stood up to anyone, and sometimes respectfully, sometimes raising his voice, but always championing what he believed to be true and what he'd come to know as being right. And he never let that go, and we're gonna miss him. Thank you, Shauna. Hawa.
Hawa Miles. Dr. Suzuki, if you wouldn't mind turning your camera back on, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. I did want to add something. I've just recently written a letter of recommendation for a man named Daniel Pauly, who is to the oceans what Dave Schindler was to the land and the air. Daniel Pauly is a giant in marine biology. And one of the things that's been remarkable about his work is that Daniel recognized that if he went to the artisanal fishers, that is, these are people that go out in the traditional way in their dugouts and fish with a line or a small net, and ask them about things that he wanted to know. They provided far more and better information than any scientists or technologists. That is, artisanal knowledge added to his work as a scientist. And I think that's what makes Dave Schindler so special. It's not just that he respected Indigenous knowledge, he saw that it added as well to the work he was doing as a scientist. And that's really what reconciling ways of knowing is all about. How do we bring these two very different ways of seeing the world together so that they add to each other? And Dave exemplified that big time. The big question we're asking is, who's going to come up and fill his shoes? And that's a really big question, because they're pretty big shoes. And I don't know among the young ones whether there are people capable of doing that. But it begins, I think, with a profound respect for knowledge that has been acquired over millennia.
Great, thank you, David. I do have a question coming in from the audience, so we'll turn to this question now, and it's a challenging one, I'm sure, to answer. Does the panel have any idea as to how a downstream health study can be made to happen after so much scientific evidence on the impacts of the tar sands has been uncovered and so much heel dragging on the parts of both levels of government? So anyone, Melody, you go ahead.
Well, I'll ask Lisa to chime in because her and I have worked on a joint proposal for a health study for the community, our community of Fort Chip. It has been submitted to Health Canada. It's fairly comprehensive and to be determined, John. I mean, we're pushing, we're advocating, we're writing letters, preparing for every opportunity, but we feel we've done what we can in terms of a proposal, introducing our methodology of how we would like to see the study. Yeah, Lisa, would you like to add?
Yeah, Mel and I have been asking for a community-based health study for I think 10 years now, but you can't approach doing work in a community as we can't feel like we're being studied. We have to be pursuing the program in a way that it's community driven. So just ground up, just work with us from the ground up, because if you come to us and say, yeah, I want to study you, then what? We're guinea pigs? We're not going to be guinea pigs here. We're going to have a say in the methodology. We're going to have a say in how it's done, how you conduct yourself in the community, how you report it, what you're going to do with the report. It all has to be intertwined with us. And a lot of the work that, Dr. Schindler did, and this is a joint review panel report. This is a huge report. This is from one hearing, from one project. Who's looking at these? Who's looking to make sure that all those recommendations are complete? There's a lot of work still to be done. There's a lot of oil sands development affecting us. A lot of questions we have that are still not answered. And how long do we have to wait? Our community is still waiting on the health one. We have groundwater questions. Yeah, sorry, I might go on and on here. Thank you. I hope I answered the question.
If I could just on another initiative that we're working on, it's not pertaining specifically to the health study, but we have recognized the importance of strong science and research, credible, peer-reviewed, and we are working on a new initiative, which is about reconciling both knowledge systems of Western and Indigenous knowledge. And we're doing this through a new initiative called the Delta Institute in honor of protecting our Peace Athabasca Delta. And so through this Delta Institute, we are developing a business plan. We now have bylaws and hopefully one day it'll be a reality. So we could pay tribute to great scientists like Dr. Schindler in driving research, in advancing science and Indigenous knowledge for the protection of Mother Earth and our Delta.
Melody. Thank you, and thanks. I believe that question was coming from Dr. John O'Connor, another scientist who has stood up in light of great social, political, and professional pressures as well, to lend his voice to the environmental injustices felt by Melody and Lisa and their First Nations. I wonder if panelists could also answer this question. What do you think is needed from scientists in carrying forward the legacy of knowledge co-production today? Any of the panelists want to speak to that about knowledge co-production?
Well, I think a lot of work is now coming with environmental organizations working with Indigenous people. It's going to be hard to well, maybe not, I don't know, crack the nut of getting money to support these things. I mean, to answer the previous question, what's the reason these studies don't get done is government always act as if you don't do the studies, the problem doesn't exist. By supporting a study, you're acknowledging that this is something that matters. And let's face it, politics and economics is what drives government policies. I can't imagine Jason Kenney supporting any kind of study like the kind that Melody is proposing be done. I mean, it's politics, and what the driver of politics in Alberta, of course, is the fossil fuel industry. So that's your impediment. The projects, and David Schindler's big study that was done to show that the government monitoring program was a joke really was possible because he got outside money coming in and sponsoring the study he did. It wasn't that he got government money for that. Government wouldn't give him that kind of money. So this I think is a dilemma. I just can't imagine government embracing the kind of project you're proposing because there are too many political implications of that kind of information. So they'd rather ignore it and pretend that it's not a real problem. Maybe I'm getting too cynical as an elder, but that's my take on it.
Shauna, Miles here. I think in the scientists who want to pursue the truth and making change as Dr. Schindler did, stay true to that pursuit. If you're looking for the truth, if you're looking for the way things really are, which scientists say they're doing, pursue that to the best of your ability and your discipline, and keep an open mind. And if there are other ways of knowing, scientists don't know everything, Indigenous people don't know everything. We're only human beings. We're not supernatural beings. We're humble little humans with limited powers. So be open to other ways of knowing, and respect those in the pursuit of finding the right way. That's what it's going to take. And at some point, we're all going to have to make a step of faith to get to what's happening, to extrapolate what we are really certain we know with doing the right thing or doing things in the proper way. That's just part of building cultures and part of building ways of knowing. So I see three. Who's going to fill Dr. Schindler's shoes? I see three panelists right here who are doing it already. Keep it up and challenge the rest of us to support you. That's what we're here for. We're building this dialogue, but we're also building a network of allies who believe in pursuing the real truth, believe in respecting each other and infusing our relationships with justice. Just keep going.
Miles. And so maybe we'll have one more question before we move to our closing today. And I'll just leave it open to the panel and see who would like to provide an answer. So do you think or feel that there's a role for social scientists to play in this context? And if so, what is it? That's a question coming from Gabrielle Slowly.
Is it okay if I respond?
Yes,
Thanks.
please.
It's kind of a bridge between the last two questions, if you're all right with that. But when Indigenous people and other parties are part of developing policy and implementing it, we come to this really interesting path of where are we going to go next. And one of the things that we worked on with the Slave River and Delta Partnership, which was a group that had community questions about some of the changes that they were seeing on their river, including what the effects of oil sands development and other upstream development may be, is that we came together, prioritized research questions together, brought in social scientists and Western scientists as well as knowledge holders together, and they designed projects and worked together and got funding. And it was really interesting because we worked with the communities on how the researchers would provide the information back to communities. So there were templates that were developed to answer certain questions so that it was more plain language and that accessible to communities. And it always started with, why are we doing this work? And then what did we find? And what does it mean? And what will we do next with this information, right? And one of the interesting things was that on the science side, working with social scientists, we ended up, there were publications that were published in the literature, and they were co-authored because it was knowledge co-production that was happening on ice, for example, conditions on the Slave River. There's Indigenous people in the communities and the Slave River and Delta Partnership at large that are authors on the paper. So we've worked together in that instance, for example, to make sure that the communications that are going to the communities are in a way that they can use and understand, and that the communications that are going to the scientific community show what happens and the benefits to work if you work with Indigenous people and those that know the land. And I just thought that, you know, you had asked about what can we do and how should social scientists be involved. And I think that when you get people together and you ask them what they want to do, and everyone, you know, comes in and says what they can contribute to that, that's how you start. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. And so before we close off and invite Elder Alice Rigney to join us again for a closing prayer, I would like us all just to take 1 minute of silence to honor Dr. Schindler for all the gifts that he gave to all of us. So if you'll be silent with me for 1 minute. Chimigwich, all my relations. We thank you today for joining us. And, you know, I found this dialogue to be very inspiring and bringing us back to one of the key reasons that the conveners wanted to start this Reconciling Ways of Knowing gathering was to create opportunities for scientists and Indigenous knowledge holders to learn from each other and learn to work together. And I think Dr. Schindler exemplified ways in which this could be done. So Chimigwich, Hawa, Masicho, thank you to everyone for joining today. And now I'll turn it over to Elder Alice Rigney for the closing.
Masicho. As I listened to all the panel and those that spoke about David Schindler, I have to say that I was proud to call him our friend. He was approachable, knowledgeable, and he worked so hard for us, you know, for our water, our land and air, and to prove his findings that the oil sands was destroying our land and that a way of life has disappeared. My community respected David Schindler. He didn't worry about introducing himself with his letters behind his name. He was humble. He attended our water conference, and I could see him floating around the grounds talking to anybody that would do, he had time for. We listened to him. We appreciation. Industry didn't, as we all know. And I remember when I heard the news of his retirement, it was like, oh no, who's going to be there for us? Who's going to talk for us? But now we know we have people on the panel. And it was with sadness that we saw him leave, but happy for him that he got to enjoy his retirement. And in every story told and every memory shared, the light of David will shine, and that's his legacy. So peaceful rest, David, and may your spirit soar. And now I'll say a closing prayer in my language. No tina du dinik e no ya tiadint akde no dant no ba huzu. Daida ha heris kese no anene estol fleon edri in cloud dene hotieno it's any lay. Ebe ya tia bet a no banatzer and no tulu heska ha sion klina harion dene. Eba baharis kesen dutenek et antu hinaha nen onderant esse. E atre dutenek et aharion serit ak masi desese masicho.
Masi, Alice. And now for some final housekeeping remarks, I'll throw it back over to our Reconciling Ways of Knowing host, Jackie Miller.
Thanks, Shauna. Thank you to Elder Alice Rigney, Shauna, David, Melody, Lisa, Erin, Nancy, Miles, and our attendees for sharing your time and reflections with us today. I'd like to particularly thank Shauna for initiating the idea to hold this event in conversation with a number of our conveners here, and for pulling together this great group of people. I just wanted to take a moment there to give that particular credit to Shauna, who really brought this together. So thank you, Shauna. And thank you to all of you for your comments and questions today. It's really great to see the engagement and the deep feelings of appreciation for Dr. Schindler and for our panelists today. We'll be sending out a short survey soon after our session. And I think Eden has dropped the link in the chat. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us about the program today. Our next dialogue that we're planning will be on Indigenous nationhood, ways of knowing, and nation-to-nation relationships, with Reconciling Ways of Knowing convener and former president of the Haida Nation, Miles Richardson, as a lead speaker and thought leader on that, along with a number of other speakers that we're working to confirm. And we look forward to sharing updates with you on that soon. Please visit our website, waysofknowingforum.ca, to be sure you're signed up for updates, and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook if you're on those platforms. And last but not least, please donate to support our ability to bring you these dialogues. You can do so at waysofknowingforum.ca. Thank you.